The song didn't come from strategy or branding. It came from survival. Anxiety wasn't written to top charts. It was written because Patrice Roberts needed air. She needed language for something that had lived in her chest for years without a name anyone around her took seriously. When the track was finished, she sat alone in the studio, headphones still on, tears sliding silently down her face. It wasn't pride she felt, it was exposure. Because once you name the thing that's been controlling you, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. Would people understand? Would they hear vulnerability or weakness? Would they finally see Patrice, or would they turn away? The song was released anyway, and something unexpected happened. Messages began pouring in from women, men, young performers, mothers, students, professionals. People who had never stepped on a stage and people whose lives unfolded under constant scrutiny. They weren't talking about the beat or the melody. They were talking about themselves. This is me. I thought I was alone. I didn't know how to explain it until now. Patrice had spent her entire life hiding anxiety. Now, by accident, she had given it a voice for thousands of others. But healing is not linear. And relief, when it comes, is often temporary. Because love, real love, has a way of reopening wounds you thought you'd learn to manage. Ricardo Drew had been part of Patrice's life for years. Their story wasn't clean or simple, and that was precisely why the public felt entitled to dissect it. He was charismatic, flawed, deeply present, and deeply complicated. Their bond didn't fit the neat narratives people preferred for women in the spotlight. They loved each other fiercely. They hurt each other honestly. They stayed connected even when separation seemed healthier. And then there was Lily. Their daughter changed everything. Motherhood softened Patrice in ways fame never could. Lily grounded her, terrified her, expanded her capacity for love beyond anything she had known. Every decision became heavier. Every risk carried new consequences. What does it mean to chase dreams when someone else's future depends on you? How do you balance ambition with safety? How do you model strength without teaching your child that suffering is normal? Patrice wrestled with these questions quietly. Publicly, she smiled. On stage, Patty thrived. At home, Patrice lay awake wondering whether she was doing any of it right. Ricardo, for all his flaws, understood parts of her that no one else ever had. He had seen her panic attacks. He had felt her shaking hands. He knew how to talk her back into her body when anxiety tried to pull her apart. They argued. They separated. They found their way back to each other in new forms. Their love didn't follow rules. It followed gravity. And gravity, eventually, pulls everything down. On December 12, 2023, Patrice walked into the radio station expecting another routine interview. She was engaged. She was planning a wedding. She was speaking about joy, about beginnings. Her voice was warm. Her laughter easy. Then the phone rang. What happens inside the body when shock hits? Does time slow down? Or does it vanish entirely? How does the brain process words that make no sense? Ricardo had been found unresponsive in Antigua. 38 years old. No warning. No goodbye. In that moment, something ancient took over. Patty stepped forward. Patrice stayed on the microphone. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't run. She finished the interview. She thanked the hosts. She held herself together with a discipline she had practiced her entire life. Listeners would later say they heard something shift in her voice, but they couldn't name it. A pause. A tightness. A fragility barely contained. Behind the scenes, her world had already ended. What does it mean to grieve when you're still being watched? How do you break when your job requires composure? Where do you put pain when there is no space for it? After the broadcast ended, Patrice left the building and sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, body finally allowing what her mind had been blocking. The tears came violently. Her chest burned. Her breath fractured. Ricardo was gone. The man she loved. The father of her child. The one person who knew how to calm her when anxiety threatened to take everything. Grief didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a flood. In the days that followed, The world responded in predictable ways. Headlines, tributes, social media posts filled with condolences and speculation. Some people were kind, others were cruel. Many felt entitled to analyze her pain as if it were entertainment. But something else arrived too. Silence. At night, when the noise faded, Patrice was left alone with questions she had no answers for. Had she said enough? Had he known how deeply she loved him? Had she wasted time believing there would always be more? That's when the recording surfaced. Ricardo had left a message. A private audio file meant only for her. He had recorded it months earlier, not because he expected to die, but because he understood uncertainty. Because he knew life didn't always give warnings. When Patrice pressed play, his voice filled the room. He spoke calmly, lovingly, honestly. He talked about Lily, about how proud he was of Patrice, not just the performer, but the woman who fought invisible battles every day and still showed up for others. He acknowledged their struggles. He didn't romanticize their pain. He didn't deny their mistakes. And then he said something that would stay with her forever. If you ever hear this, it means I couldn't stay. But I need you to keep living. Not surviving. Living. How do you breathe after that? How do you accept love that arrives after loss? How do you honor someone who believed in you more than you believed in yourself? That recording didn't just break Patrice's heart, it reframed her grief. Ricardo hadn't wanted to be remembered as tragedy. He wanted to be remembered as presence. And suddenly, Patrice understood something she hadn't before. Patty, the alter ego she created to survive, had kept her alive. But Patrice, the woman beneath, had never fully learned how to live. Grief stripped away performance. There was no stage where she could hide. No lights bright enough to blind the pain. For the first time, she had to exist as one person. The months that followed were brutal. Some days, she couldn't get out of bed. Other days, she threw herself into work, desperate for distraction. Anxiety returned with new intensity, now tangled with sorrow. Lily asked questions Patrice struggled to answer. Where is Daddy? Why can't I talk to him? Is he coming back? How do you explain death to a child when you don't understand it yourself? Patrice learned quickly that strength doesn't always look like composure. Sometimes it looks like honesty. Sometimes it looks like admitting you don't know what comes next. She began therapy, not just casually, but seriously. Not to fix herself, but to understand herself. She unpacked years of performance anxiety, childhood pressure, survival mechanisms that had once protected her but were now limiting her. The alter ego came under scrutiny. Who was Patty now? Did she still serve a purpose, or was she preventing healing? Slowly, Patrice began integrating the two selves, allowing vulnerability on stage, speaking openly about anxiety, grief, and mental health without polishing the edges. The public response surprised her again. Instead of pulling away, people leaned in. Fans who had once idolized her now related to her. Young women saw permission to be imperfect. Men heard validation for emotions they'd been taught to suppress. I Am Woman evolved from a concert series into a movement. Workshops, conversations, safe spaces for artists and non-artists alike to talk about mental health without shame. Patrice wasn't just performing anymore. She was transforming. But healing didn't erase longing. There were moments, quiet, ordinary moments, when Ricardo's absence hit hardest. School pickups, late-night thoughts, decisions she wished she could talk through with him. Grief didn't shrink. It changed shape. And with time, Patrice realized something essential. Love doesn't end because a life does. Ricardo's presence lived on in Lily's laughter. In the recording. In the way Patrice now approached life with intention rather than fear. She stopped chasing perfection. Stopped measuring worth by applause. Stopped pretending strength meant silence. When she returned to the stage fully, something was different. The crowds were still loud. The lights still bright. But Patrice stood there as herself, not as Patty alone. And for the first time, anxiety didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled her. She spoke openly in interviews about the radio moment, about the shock, about staying on air while her world shattered. People asked how she did it. Her answer was simple. I had been practicing survival my whole life. But survival, she learned, is not the same as living. Living requires risk. Living requires honesty. Living requires letting people see you even when you're breaking. Patrice Roberts' story isn't one of tragedy alone. It's a story of adaptation. Of how a child from a small fishing village learned to split herself in two to survive, and then, through loss, learned how to become whole again. It's a story that asks uncomfortable questions. What parts of yourself have you created just to get through the day? What would happen if you didn't need them anymore? And if life took everything familiar away, would you still know who you are? Patrice does now. Not because she stopped hurting, but because she stopped hiding. And in a world that often rewards performance over truth, that may be her most powerful act yet. Patrice learned early that the world rewards people who can keep moving. The applause is loudest for those who look unshakable. The cameras love certainty. The tabloids crave a narrative that fits its neat edges. Rise, fall, redemption, repeat. It is easier for everyone if the story can be mapped onto a tidy graph. Chart the hits, the loves, the scandals, the comebacks, and then forget the messy in-betweens. But Patrice's life never fit a tidy graph. It was a map of fault lines, of aftershocks that arrived years after the first tremor. It was a song with too many keys. When she was 9, she climbed onto the stage at a junior Calypso Monarch contest, clutching a microphone that felt larger than her body. The lights were hot like midday. The crowd swelled with adults who smelled of lime and sugar and promise. Patrice was tiny then, her voice a ribbon trying to unfurl, but something inside her recognized the way a crowd could hold you. It could both lift you and make your chest hollow. That first crown became more than a trophy. It became a template. By the time Patty emerged, the persona, the armor, the glittering silhouette that took the stage and swallowed the room, she had learned to build exits. Patty did not ask for help. Patty took a bow and kept going. Patty traded off the tremor in Patrice's hands for a practiced smile. Patty was a shield forged out of rhythm, calypso swing, and bravado. The name that stuck in the press, Patty, became shorthand for a life that seemed effortless and permanent. But the person behind it remained a private geography, full of narrow alleys and rooms she seldom visited when the lights were on. The Belgium Salon was one such room. It was an accident of travel and an unintended lesson. Patrice was in her 20s, early in the years when success felt both exhilarating and precarious. A promotional tour had taken her to a small cultural festival in Brussels, and after a show she found herself in a salon tucked behind a canal, sipping tea and listening to a woman in her 30s talk about how she used substances to silence the noise of an anxious mind. The woman's words were soft and ashamed, and Patrice remembers the hair on her arms lifting, not from the chill of the room but from recognition. She had not yet learned the vocabulary to name her own private storms. No therapist's language, no guided breathing exercises, no artful interviews about mental health. She only knew that when crowds gathered, a pressure built in her chest and her throat felt bigger than usual. Listening to that confessional, she made a promise to herself: no chemical solution. Her escape would be another thing. Music. Performance would be medicine. But promises can be springboards and shackles at once. The stage did indeed save her. The roar would erase the tightness in her chest. But it also taught her to bury pain deep so it would not leak into recordings or rehearsals. The thing about survival tools built in childhood is they are brilliant at helping you survive one thing, and then, without warning, they become inadequate for a different kind of wound. Ricardo came into her life with the kind of force that disoriented equilibrium. He was charismatic in a quiet way, a laugh that arrived late and lit a room, hands that mapped ideas in the air, a patience that seemed endless. They met through mutual friends in the circuit that connected Caribbean artists. Their chemistry was visible on stage and off. When he proposed at Drew's Day in Antigua in July 2022, he did it in a moment that felt chosen for its public intimacy. Cameras, confetti, the roar of a crowd that had seen them perform next to each other for years. Patrice said yes. For many, that proposal would have been the culmination, proof that the messy narrative could be smoothed into a clear line. For Patrice, It was a temporary reordering. What did the proposal promise? Stability. A new version of herself? A life less punctuated by anxious nights? For months afterwards, the air around them shifted. They spoke of forever in interviews with measured smiles. There were plans, venues scouted for a wedding, names of guests underlined on a tentative list, chatter about a honeymoon that would feel like a bomb. For fans, it was the reveal of chastened joy. For Patrice, it was hope held tight but fragile. December 12, 2023, should have been an ordinary day. Patrice was on air, relaxed with the cadence of someone who had spent years learning to shape words into a sound. She spoke about wedding designs, about balancing career and partnership, about how Ricardo kept her grounded. Thousands were listening. The interview ended. Then her phone rang. The person on the other end reached for language that was always clumsy in the face of sudden ruin. Ricardo Drew had been found unresponsive in Antigua. He was 38. He was already gone. Imagine hearing news like that and continuing to talk, to smile, to sign autographs, because the entire machinery of your career was still moving and because a single public reaction could become the whole of your private grief. Patrice did not scream. She did not collapse on air in the melodramatic way the tabloids would later describe. Instead, she registered the fact as if it were a remote statistic, a few words, a pinch of horror, an axis shift inside her chest. Later, when she posted, "I don't even know where to begin," people took it as a fragment, a moment of honesty. Few imagined the aftermath. What happens when the person who promised to be a constant in your life choose, for reasons the world will speculate about, to leave a recorded message for you and no one else? Ricardo, in an act that was by turns anguished and deliberate, recorded a message for Patrice. It was not a manifesto, nor a list of apologies. It was a quiet thing, reassurance shaped into syllables, a plea that she live, instruction to carry on, permission to grieve and to keep going. That recording reached her after his death had been announced publicly. It arrived like a hand on a back, grounding and impossible. Why would someone record words for another if they knew they might not be there to deliver them in person? Did he foresee the storm that would follow? Was it a premonition or a sober acceptance of mortality? Those questions hovered in the air and were never fully answerable. But the recording did give Patrice a strange private permission, an audible blessing that said it was okay to continue, to build, to become messy and human beyond the icon that would headline festivals. The public narrative fractured in two directions. Critics, who loved precision, accused her of coldness when she walked back on stage days after his death to perform. Fans tried to reconcile their grief with the performative grace she displayed night after night. What they did not see was the way grief lived inside her as a separate organism. On stage, Patty took over. She moved, sang, laughed in the right places. Off stage, Patrice fell apart in small private ways, collapsing into the armchair of her dressing room and sobbing until her voice lost recognition, sleeping badly, waking with panic in her chest like an old animal yelping at a new danger. Why would someone perform right after losing a partner? Is that strength or a survival mechanism? For Patrice, the answer was complicated. She had sworn not to follow the route some took: substances, self-destruction. Instead, she relied on exactly the thing that had once saved her: music. The stage was both a medicine and a battlefield. It allowed her to channel the uncontainable into something shaped and rhythmic. It gave the world a version of her that could be applauded. But that version required an enormous toll. The tour did not pause. Barbados, New York, Toronto, the cities were punctures through her days, each performance a vein she had to navigate. Every sold-out night felt like a contract. She had to show up. The world expected continuity. That continuity was an obligation she both chose and resented. In dressing rooms, she sometimes caught her reflection and did not recognize the woman looking back. The makeup smeared from crying, the smile that had been rehearsed for decades. Once, a fan caught her after a show and said, tearful and trembling, "You're the strongest woman I know." It landed wrong. Strength is not the same as endurance. Strength suggests an unbreakable core. Endurance implies repeated dosages of pressure that the body learns to survive. Patrice felt more the latter. She was surviving, not invincible. Music became confession. Mind My Business, which began as an offhand line in a late-night writing session, became a survival mantra. Drink water and mind my business. Those words were simple, and yet they were a boundary spelled out in public, a small instruction to herself to stay present in the things she could control. Great Escape, produced by Tano and Precision Productions, arrived as a reclamation. It was a laboratory of feeling where she and her producers distilled panic and therapy sessions into a chorus you could dance to and cry to at the same time. Listening to it, people found a mirror for very private sensations. It became less a pop song and more a ritual that allowed others to name their own breathlessness. Other songs followed the arc of her life. Roxo, arriving in December 2025, braided Soa with Afrobeat in a way that felt both defiant and protective. A hymn for keeping peace when the world conscripts pieces of your selfhood. Capital, a carnival-tinged track featuring Macau Tiha, was an exercise in joyful mourning, releasing confetti while acknowledging a broken heart beneath the sequins. Mday, produced by iBeats, paid tribute to the men in her life and the mothers who raised them. It was tender without being sentimental, a song that asked listeners to hold complexity instead of seeking simplicity. What did it feel like to write these songs? For Patrice, the studio became a confessional booth and a lab. There were sessions where she wrote through tears, where words bled into melodies and left a stain of truth. There were other sessions where she tried to be clever and failed, and the track sat in limbo for months. The real work, she discovered, happened in the messy middle, between therapy appointments and phone calls from managers and late-night studio runs where she would sit on the floor with headphones and sip water between takes. The result was music that felt lived in. Awards came. In August 2025, she was named Female SOA Artist of the Year for the third consecutive time. The recognition came with glitter and speeches. It also came with the reminder that accolades can be both a balm and a weight. The Grammy Global Spin Series feature her performance of Mind My Business. The clip spread quickly, becoming a visual shorthand for what a public person could do when they demanded boundaries. But accolades cannot erase panic attacks. They cannot make absence into a person again. Patrice's personal life had dimensions that fame could not commodify. She was a mother to Lily, a detail that grounded her in a way no studio could. Lily's presence reoriented priorities. There were mornings where Patrice would wake, hair mussed, to find the small hand of her daughter touching her cheek as if to validate existence. Parenthood complicated grief and success in equal measure. It was both a balm and an added responsibility. How do you explain absence to a child when the adult world offers incomplete answers? Patrice learned to translate sorrow into stories Lily could hold. Soft, safe tales that did not flatten the truth but rendered it manageable. She also became a mentor. Emerging artists reached out to her for guidance, for the kind of counsel that is only earned through experience. She offered studio time, advice on handling contracts, and, more crucially, a kind of moral support around mental health. In studios that had once felt like pressure cookers, she helped create spaces where vulnerability was allowed. She counseled younger performers to cultivate tools that didn't involve self-erasure. The youth program she supported, workshops in Caribbean islands and city centers that taught songwriting and stagecraft, became extensions of her belief that music could be therapy, career, and community. People began to speak of Patrice differently. No longer just an icon, she was a conduit. Interviews shifted from gossip about relationships to earnest questions about grief and resilience. She became an advocate for mental health campaigns, panel discussions, late-night conversations about therapy stigma, work that felt vital. Yet advocacy didn't make her immune to judgment. There were columns that called her relationship toxic, and others that sniffed that she used grief as performance. The media, with its appetite for either saints or sinners, refused to accept complexity. But Patrice learned that complexity would not be simplified for public consumption, and that she could map her own truths without waiting for approval. There were harder scenes than award stages and studio booths. Patrice had to navigate bureaucracy and rumors. There were calls from managers asking whether she could delay shows. There were fans who demanded explanations they were not owed. There were nights when her insomnia would leave her scrolling through comments that hardened a new grief, the grief of being misread. Yet there were also letters, handwritten notes from people who had listened to her and finally named their own panic attacks or sought help. Those notes mattered more than anything the tabloids could print. They were the proof that music had become a bridge. By late 2025 and into 2026, Patrice's sound had broadened. Soca fused with other genres. Collaborations with artists like Nyla Blackman and Soca in Mocha were less nostalgic callbacks and more dialogues across a generational continuum. On stage, these performances felt like reunion and reclamation. The artists reminisced about their shared roots and how music had kept them alive. In smaller rooms, Patrice sometimes allowed herself to play acoustic sets. No glitter, just raw voice and a guitar, where she would pause between songs and talk about therapy, medication, panic attacks, and the small rituals that had helped her breathe again. Those nights were rarely recorded. They were gifts for the people who showed up to listen. What did healing look like for her? It was not linear. It was therapy sessions that sometimes felt futile, followed by weeks where the cognitive tools they taught her did help. It was joining a grief group and being surprised to find companionship in strangers. It was learning that medication, once so feared in that Belgium salon, was, for some, a useful tool, not a moral failing. It was realizing that survival could include asking for help and that holding an image of invulnerability had cost her dearly. She learned to hold both pain and joy in one body, to laugh at a rehearsal and weep in the car ride home. She learned to let Patty sing and for Patrice to rest. There were also revelations about the nature of performance and authenticity. People often asked which version of her was real. The dazzling Patty who danced beneath spotlights or the quieter Patrice who lit candles for loved ones and made pancakes for her daughter on Sunday mornings. She stopped answering that question with a heroic declaration and instead said, both. They were different tools for different contexts. Patty was not a lie. She was a necessary mode, a way to distribute strength across a room. Patrice was the inner scaffolding that allowed Patty to function without collapsing. The recording Ricardo left shifted in significance as time went on. It became a talisman she played on hard nights, a proof that love had been real and that permission, strange as it sounds, had been given to continue. That message did not soothe the pain away. It reframed it. Instead of an abrupt end, there was a narrative thread. A man who loved her enough to tell her to keep living. How many of us could survive under such a paradox? Grief that is both a void and a map. She returned to his words when she needed anchor, each replay a small ritual. And yet, the presence of absence remained palpable. Even as she built programs and released songs that became anthems for others, she lived with a daily rhythm that had been altered by loss. Sometimes, at 3 a.m, she would replay Ricardo's message and let the cadence of his "the final revelation," if a life can ever be reduced to single revelations, was not that she had become stronger. It was that she had become more fully herself. Patty and Patrice were never separate. They were two dialects of the same language, two lenses through which she navigated the world. The revelation was that wearing armor is normal and sometimes necessary, but that armor can be returned to its box without losing the function it once served. The public demands of an artist can coexist with private healing. They can, in fact, feed each other in strange and fortifying ways. How many people around us are surviving by pretending? What happens when pretending is no longer enough? Patrice's life asked those questions not in lectures but in songs and in the messy honesty of performances where sometimes she would fail and then pull herself back into rhythm. It is easy to think of resilience as a single event. The comeback album, the triumphant return. But resilience is often accumulation. The slow gathering of small disciplines, the practice of showing up, the insistence on seeking help, the building of communities that will carry the load. If her story teaches one enduring thing, it is this. You can lose everything and still find the will to continue. Not as a headline, not as a glossy comeback story, but as the day-to-day work of living with grief while allowing joy to enter in other forms. Patrice's life becomes a ledger in which loss and love keep balancing each other. In the end, the stage was never an escape from reality. It was the language she used to translate life's untranslatable corners. It was where she turned panic into rhythm and gave millions a phrase, "Drink water and mind my business," that could be used as a tool. It was where she learned to be both hero and human. If you listen carefully to her catalog, Toxic Love, Mind My Business, Great Escape, Roxo, Capital, Mday, you will hear a life being translated. You will hear danceable beats that hold confession, choruses that offer boundaries, bridges that admit to breaking. You will hear the work of a woman who chose, again and again, to show up. For her daughter, for her fans, for herself. How many people around us are surviving by pretending? Maybe more than we know. Maybe the first step for all of us is to notice, to ask, to be gentle, and to allow a space where the real, vulnerable self can breathe. That is what Patrice chose to do, out loud, imperfectly, and with songs that kept many of us company on nights when the world felt too loud. There is no neat ending to her story, only pages still being written. But the message is clear. You can lose everything and still find the will to continue. You can perform, grieve, and heal. You can be both Patty and Patrice, armor and heart, holding grief and joy in one body. And when we ask the hard questions, when we invite authentic conversation into the spaces of spectacle, we might just find that survival is less lonely than it first appears.